Well, hello. Is that all right? Let me tell you, when the service is over, you need to beeline to the back, to the trees, because our people, when it comes to helping others and getting tags off trees, it's like locusts. I mean, you will look back there and it'll be full like it is right there on us, a lot of them. And I'll look back at the end and like, where'd every single tag go? So make sure you don't dilly-dally. Don't dilly-dally. If anything else you need to do, get that, then get the kids. That's what I'm saying. Okay, all right, we're in our family series. I'm going to move this up a little closer. Every year I do a series, 3 weeks on the family. And last week we talked about marriage. This week we'll talk about children. Next week we will be talking about sex. And if you have children under the age of 11, something like that, over that, they really need to be in here and hear the stuff we're talking about. But if they're under that, you have two options. You can plug them into children's ministry, or you can explain to them on the way home what that word Pastor Steve used means. I've only seen it once. Only one time in the history of the church have I seen a woman literally throw her 4-year-old over her shoulder and run out of the room. Only once during the entire time I've been doing this message, and I've been doing it for a long time. So, but it's not that bad. But be ready, be forewarned, and do not. Well, some of you are going to do this anyway. Don't watch from home. Everybody says we're just going to watch this one from home. Don't do that. Come here. I need feedback. I need people. So anyway, today we're talking about kids, and we raised 3, and Kim did an amazing job. They're pretty good kids. When they were young, their absolute favorite movie, at least one of them, Sierra, the middle one, her favorite movie, they all 3 loved it, was Finding Nemo. Sierra, literally, my middle daughter, who's now a mother of 5, could literally, it was like hitting a play button, and she could recite the movie. She could start and tell you every line in Finding Nemo. She might still be able to do it. I don't know. I haven't checked. We haven't pushed play recently to see what happens, but she loved this movie. Now, in the movie, you guys remember there's a clownfish, right, named Marlin. I can never remember Marlin's name. He's the one I don't remember his name, but Marlin is the dad. And Nemo gets taken to an aquarium in Sydney, Australia, and he finds Dory, the forgetful fish, and they go through the ocean and all kinds of adventures going to go get Nemo. Now, at one point, Marlin is depressed, discouraged, because he wasn't supposed to let Nemo get taken, right? That was the whole point of being a dad, was he wasn't supposed to let Nemo get taken. And here's some dialogue. I would show you the movie clip, but then YouTube would shut down our feed, and so I have to just tell it to you, and if you go home and watch it, again, I'm sure it's on YouTube. Okay. Marlin says, I promised I'd never let anything happen to him. And Dory, as she does, said, that's a funny thing to promise. And Marlin says, what? And Dory says, well, you can't never let anything happen to him, then nothing would ever happen to him. And there is a deeper truth in there, because all of us as parents want to make it so nothing bad ever happens to our children. That's one of our goals, is to make it so bad things don't happen to our children. And what's the problem with that premise? We live in a screwed up universe, and they're screwed up people. So I hate to break this to you new parents, bad things are going to happen to your kid, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to prevent it. Okay? There is nothing. You cannot prevent your child. I know this is cheer. Steve, you just went from Finding Nemo to depression. I feel like Marlin now. There is nothing you can do to keep your child from having bad situations, trauma, shame, guilt. They are part of the human experience. Your child is going to encounter those things. You can help them be ready for it. A woman named Diane Langberg writes some really good stuff dealing with trauma and guilt and shame and all those things. And she says this in one of her books. She says, those of us with more resources and affirming history process, we process shame differently than those who have no inner resources. Those who have led relatively safe lives and come from stable homes and communities have a reserve from which to draw. such that even when shame, that experience does not swallow up the self and utterly define it. You cannot determine whether your child will encounter shame, guilt, trauma. You can help make it so they are prepared to handle it. You can build the reserve in them so that when the bad things happen at a reasonable amount, they have the reserve to deal with it. I like to use the concept of chips. You know, like in poker, you get a bunch of chips. And in all situations in life, you can picture that as like a game theory concept. You have a certain amount of chips. You know, in certain situations, you've got all the chips. And you can do whatever you want. And you go to other situations, you got no chips. And you're totally dependent on other people. And what you can do is you can help your child acquire the emotional chips so that when somebody comes along and something bad happens, let's say something bad happens and it's a 100-chip bad thing. Well, if they've got 200 chips, they give 200 chips. They still got 100. They're still all right. They got 7 chips and a 100-chip problem happens. There's nothing. They don't have the ability to handle it. And you see that around you. You see the people when trauma happens. Now, I'm not saying they're good or bad people. That's nothing to do with it. Do you have the inner resources, the inner reserves that have been built in you over time? I've said for years, I am one of the most fortunate people in the world because what it would take for me to be in a really, 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 really bad situation is a lot because people have been giving me chips. My parents just poured chips into me. My grandparents poured chips into me. Teachers poured chips into me. People have been handing me chips my entire life. And so I can handle quite a few things. But there are people who don't have those situations. So what you want to do as a parent is you want to be consciously developing your child's inner resources so that there's some resiliency. So that when the bad things happen, they've got the ability to deal with it. Does that make sense? Okay? So a central goal of parenting is to help children develop the inner resources that can help them deal with the challenges life will bring. And let me throw this in there. So some of you guys have kids, and some of you have kids that are grown. Can I tell you something? Your adult children face the same exact stuff. And you need to be, as a parent of adult children, giving them chips. And some of you have parents who take chips. Every time you call your parents, they take chips from you. Okay? They dispense guilt. Well, you can't fix that, but you can change it for yours. So that your kids, there's an ornament right there that needs to go over there. It was just free-floating, and every time I went over, I kicked it. So anyway. About once a month or so, our entire family gets together for no real reason. You know, it's just that it's the second Sunday or the second Saturday, or just it could be whatever. All 5 grandkids, all 3 kids, all in the same house. And you know why that is? Partially they're close. That's a big part of it. But part of it is their mother especially, and I try to be feeding chips to our kids to make sure we're not the ones sucking chips out of their lives, okay? So how do you help your child, adult, child, how do you help your grandchildren? Because some of you got grandkids, and your grandkids, you're worried about your grandkids, okay? Some of you got nieces and nephews, and they're in situations. You see the niece and the nephew, and they're going, boy, they're in a rough situation. How do you feed chips into a person, into a child or an adult, okay? There's 3 ways we're going to talk about 3 ways to do that. And number 1 is teach them they're valuable. That's his number 1 with a bullet. Teach them how valuable they are. Okay? In Genesis 3, Genesis 1, so important. God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Do you know how many people that applies to? What percentage of people on earth does God made them in his own image? What percentage does that apply to? 100%. You know that person you really don't like? They're 100% the image of God. And it's really important that you remember for your child, the truest thing about every child is they're made in the image of God. Now, your child's a fallen creature because A, they're human, and B, they're yours. All right? Right? And so you're all fallen. And your kid will remind you on a regular basis that they are a fallen creature. You're never going to forget that. If you start to forget that about your child, they will do something to remind you just how fallen they are. But what you have to do is, even when they are being fallen all over the place, when they're screwed up, and this time they're screwed up like they're your spouse, screwed up like the other parent today, even when that's the case, you have to constantly tell yourself, this person is made in the image of God. That's the truest thing about them. Now, the reason I say, because we are fallen creatures made in the image of God, the reason I say it's the truest thing is if you look in the Bible, you'll see in Genesis 1, we are made in the image of God. In Genesis 3, 2 chapters later, we become fallen creatures. But when you go to the book of Revelation, at the end of the Bible, for all the people who are followers of Jesus, the fallen nature gets taken out. Anything you can take out of something means it's not essential. Okay? So the fallen nature is not essential to the identity of your child. The fallen nature is not essential to your identity either. And sometimes the first thing, sometimes the first thing you want to do if you want to build the value of your child is build your own value too. If you don't acknowledge and accept that you are made in the image of God, that you have value, if you have people and voices in your head that are constantly telling you you don't have value, you need to fight those voices first, because those voices will come right on through and they'll come out your mouth when it comes to your kids. If there is a voice of somebody who's telling you you're worthless, you can't succeed, you're a failure, you quit, some of you, I just said what you say to yourself all the time. You have developed an inner monologue that speaks negativity into yourself, and those things are not necessarily true. I've said this so many times, and it's so true. If somebody else were to say to you what you say to yourself, you would slap them. If you were to hear somebody say, if your friends were standing there and somebody walked up to you and said the things you say to yourself to you, your friends would kick them out of the building. But you say those things to yourself. You are made in the image of God. You are incredibly valuable based on that and nothing else. You don't need to prove it ever. Some of you are so busy proving it. Here's what you do. I know how this works. You are so busy trying to prove your own value to yourself, you then expect your children, A, to prove their value, and B, to prove yours. That hurts, doesn't it? Some of you want your kids to succeed so you feel better about yourself. I must be a success because look at my kid. And when my kid screws up, I'm angry, not because it hurt them, but because it hurts my self-esteem. So you have to build your chips. Remind yourself, you are made in the image of God, and you are loved beyond comprehension, and you are valuable beyond anything you can measure. You make yourself understand that, and then you convince your children too. Here's a verse you need to know. Children are a gift from the Lord. They are a reward from Him. I know sometimes it feels like a curse. I know what getting kids to school is like. Oh, there are legends. When Kim was working and I happened to be home and I was trying to get the kids ready for picture day, there are stories. And there's photographic evidence. But your child's a gift. That troubled child you have, the one that's the big problem, the one that's the rebel, the one that doesn't listen. Okay, maybe they all don't listen. I don't know. Yeah, both of them, everybody. There's nobody who's listening. There's still a gift. There's still, can you imagine this? God has something He values very, very highly. Because something made in the image of God is something God values very, very highly. And God takes this thing that He values incredibly highly, and He gives it to you as a parent. And says, take care of this for me. That's what parenting is God taking something incredibly valuable, a person made in his image, handing them to you and say, would you raise this one for me? Okay? Remember that, especially when they're being jerks. Okay? Especially, because sometimes they're just asleep and they're just so sweet and angelic. And aren't they just the image of God? And sometimes they're awake. Right? Okay? But here's how God sees your kid and God sees you. God knew his people in advance, and he chose them to become like his son. You see your kid, and you're not sure about getting them out of kindergarten. God sees your kid and says, I will make them like Jesus. That's the potential God sees in your kids. And why? So that Jesus would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. He wants your kid to be at the family reunion with Jesus. Now, that leads us to the second point, because we're supposed to be teaching them they're valuable, but we also need to be training them to live their calling. This is how we give them chips, is by training them to live the calling. You letting them know what you can become, what you can be, what you can do. Proverbs 22:6, a lot of you know this verse. Direct your children on the right path. When they're older, they will not leave it. Get them on the right path. Get them working the right direction. Now, it's a proverb, not a promise, so I can't guarantee that it's always going to go exactly the way you want it to go. But if you flip it, you get something that's almost a promise. Do not you direct your children on the right path, and when they're older, it's going to be bad stuff. Guarantee you that one. Okay? Can't guarantee you this is because it's like a proverb, not a promise, but I can guarantee you the flip side. All right? Now, when we're talking about the right path, there are two guidelines, two guardrails, and they are grace and guidance. And you need both. Okay? Because some parents, and a lot of times God does a cool thing. If you have a together parents, a lot of times God does a really cool thing, and he gives you one grace parent and one guidance parent. Right? That's a really cool situation to have. If you've got one person who's the yes parent and one person who's the no parent, you get upset about that, but that's sort of God's guardrails for your family. Because they need grace and they need guidance. Because sometimes parents can become so concerned with guidance that they forget about grace. They're so busy making sure the kid follows every conceivable rule, they don't give the kid the grace the kid needs. They don't give him space. They don't give him air. But what you forget when you become the guidance parent, when you become the totally legalistic parent, is that when you're becoming the person God created you to be, it's about transformation, not subjugation. Okay? The only one who can make somebody the image of Jesus Christ, the only one who can transform them more like Jesus is God. You do not have that ability. Some of you need to repeat that back to yourself. I do not have the ability to make my child like Christ. I can't do it. I do not have the ability to do supernatural things, and being transformed into the image of Jesus Christ is a supernatural thing. I can do the guidance part, but I can't do the transformation part. So I need to recognize I need to lean on grace for me and lean on grace for them because they need it. Because when you become the legalistic parent, I've seen three results. Now, this is not scientific. This is just what I've seen. But when you have legalistic parenting, that you do it this way all the time, some kids do thrive in that. Some kids just love being told what to do. I know you don't have one of those children, but I've heard of them. Now, there are people who just love not having to worry about it. They just do this. Some people shrivel. When they're dictated to all the time, they just shrivel up. And I'm sure if you're a parent, like I'm going in my head going, how many times did I do something where I was so legalistic to my child that I actually watched them shrivel? Actually watched that happen for a second. And I know adults who were raised in very legalistic settings, and they don't always, some of them look shriveled, a lot of them don't look shriveled, but they don't have their own self-spiritual identity. all they've ever known to do is copy mom and dad. And so their spirituality looks exactly like mom and dad's, and it's not theirs. It doesn't do very well in trauma. And then some people rebel. That's what happens when you're legalistic with your kids. One of those three things is going to happen almost every time, I believe. I could be wrong. Okay? But I think when you bring grace into this situation, I think it makes everything better. A child who's raised on grace is much less likely to rebel. Okay? A child who's raised where grace is just a steady diet from the parent. I'm telling them they're in the image of God. I'm telling them how valuable they are. I'm letting them make mistakes. I'm a forgiving parent. And I know you can hit some times when it's really hard, but they're less likely to rebel. Some people are going to rebel, but they're less likely to. They're much less likely to shrivel. They're going to be the person they are intended to be if you're pouring grace into their lives. And they're also, even if they're somebody who does well with rules, they're going to do much better when they have the freedom to be themselves. It might even be a challenge for them, but they'll become a better person because grace unleashes a child's identity. Because God's about grace. And so that's what unleashes your child's identity is grace, okay? Now, so how do I do that? How do I raise a child with grace? How do I raise them with grace and guidance? Well, in Deuteronomy, there's a really cool passage in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Moses is talking to the people of Israel, and he's saying, here's how I want you to pass on your faith. And he starts out by telling them what faith to have. He says, listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. He doesn't say mind in that one. You must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands I'm giving you today. So he starts the parenting cycle by saying, okay, step one, get your spiritual act together. Right? That's what he just said. Right? Get your spiritual life where it needs to be. You be fully committed to God. And then he says, now that you've got these commands, repeat them again and again to your children. Now that you're living them, first, start repeating them to your children. Talk about them when you're at home, when you're on the road, when you're going to bed, when you're getting up. So just make it a topic of conversation with your kids. When you're doing this, you're not lecturing them, are you? It's just part of conversation. It's just tying in things. If you've heard the phrase teachable moments, it's in your kid's life during the day. This just happened. You saw this person. I think this is a Barry thing, but it's good. He tells lots of stories, and sometimes I repeat them. But he's with his kids, and there's some people out, and they got the orange jumpsuits on. They're doing some work. And Barry, because he's not going to do it as serious as possible, he wants to make sure they get it, so he adds humor to it. And so he mockingly, he doesn't roll the window down, but he looks over at them with his kids in the car and says, you made bad decisions. And it seems kind of silly, and it seems kind of, but think about it. What do you think the kids heard? What do you think the kids heard? They heard it delivered in a humorous way. It wasn't mean. It wasn't lecturing. But bad decisions lead to bad results. That was the lesson he just gave them. He doesn't even think he did that, but he did. He gave them a very good lesson. Bad decisions, bad results. And because, talk about it as you're walking around. In other words, it goes almost crazy. It says, wear them on your foreheads, write them on your doorposts, your house, and your gates. Just go crazy letting your kids know what you're living, okay? Because raising our children should be about living our faith with our children, not imposing rules on them. You want the best way to get a kid to rebel? Make them do stuff you're not willing to do yourself. Okay? Make them live a higher standard than you live. And here's the problem with that. Your kids see you all the time. They know who you are. I mean, you can fool me. I'm really easy to fool. You don't fool your kids. They know who you are. And I believe this with every fiber of my being. The most important thing you can be in front of your kids is authentic. That you live what you say you believe. The worst thing you can do is be hypocritical, where you say one thing and live another. Because kids see that. And kids reject hypocrisy more than they reject broccoli. Like, no way. They see that, they run away from it. And the problem is all of us are a little bit hypocritical. So that's where grace comes back in. Apologizing to your kids, letting them know you screwed up. Letting kids know that you're not perfect either. You don't think you are. But like I said, guidance is important too. A refusal to correct is a refusal to love. You love your children by disciplining them. Okay? But let me show you how they say to do the discipline. Twice in the Bible, there are in the books of Colossians and Ephesians, there's what we call household codes. And a household code is, here's a really quick, pithy way on how to run a house, how to make it work. Okay? There's one in Ephesians, one in Colossians. And in Colossians, it says it really quickly, and I want you to see, but watch, there's a process in what he says. The first thing he says, children, obey your parents in everything. What to do? What should you do? Obey your parents. He immediately follows with why. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. How? You do what? And do why? And then he tells the parent how to pull it off. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they'll become discouraged. I'm not going to dig into that verse, but do you see what he did? Here's what I want you to do, kid. Here's why you should do it. And parents, here's how you train them. Obey your parents. Why? God wants you to. How should parents enforce it? Make sure you don't embitter them. See, all this stuff about hypocrisy, all that thing, that embitters children. Expecting them to be what they can't be, that embitters children. See that? Now, Ephesians, he does the exact same thing. He just takes longer to do it. He starts out and says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. Same phrase. Why? For this is right. Let's expand a little bit. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy a long life on the earth. Why? Obey your parents. Why? God wants you to, and it makes your life better. It just leads to a better life to obey your parents. What? Why? Parents, how do you teach them? Do not exasperate your children. Do you see that order? You see that sequence? That's the guidance. Now, I'm not saying that once in a while you don't have to pull out because I told you to. You know, because I said so, you have to sometimes. Sometimes you're just in too tight a situation, you don't have time. But don't make that the standard. The standard is, here's what your expectations are and why they are expectations. And the how is, I am going to teach you this gently and in a way that does not exasperate you and does not leave you frustrated. Do you see that? Isn't that just incredible? So that's why he did it twice, so you had a chance to really get it. All right? So bring up your children in the training and instruction of the Lord. So we've got our first two things. Let me give you the third one. And this is going to be a challenge because some people are already in a different place with this one. But the third thing you can do to build value into your child, to help them have the strength, the resources, the resiliency, is to provide stability by staying together. Everybody goes, ooh. Because here's the thing. I just showed you in Colossians and Ephesians the household code on how to raise kids, right? I showed you. I didn't show you the beginning. I didn't show you what step 1 was, because step 2 was tell your children what to do. Step 3 was tell them why, and step 4 was how. Step 1 from Colossians, husbands, love your wives, do not be harsh with them. Husbands, love your wives, and then, children, obey your parents. Oh, what came first? The relationship you have with your spouse. Make that the model for your children to follow. Okay? In Ephesians, he also starts the same way. I won't go through the whole thing again. But each of you must love his wife as he loves himself. The wife must respect her husband. And then it says, children, obey your parents. Okay? You start with that relationship with your spouse. Because I'm going to be really honest with you in both ways, okay? If the goal, and this is heavy, I understand it. If the goal is to help your child, A, be ready for trauma, B, have the resources for it, and C, not inflict trauma yourself, the best way to do that is to have a healthy marriage and a two-parent family for them to grow up in. Every study ever done says that. Okay, this is not Steve B. It's like kids do better. Divorce inflicts trauma on children. Okay, don't let anybody tell you that that's not true. Okay, sometimes divorce happens. Sometimes it's even necessary, I think. But divorce always inflicts trauma on your children. So if your goal is to build up their chip supply so that they have enough for that, you don't want to do things that take away chips from them. And divorce takes chips from children's health. All right? And I know a lot of you have been divorced. A lot of you are going, oh gosh. I'm not telling you to feel guilty about this. What I'm telling you is to take, if you are in a split household, you need to take that into account. Okay? Understand that somewhere along the way, somebody deducted a bunch of chips out of this kid's heart. And you need to work extra hard to replenish that. Okay? Does that make sense? I know this is heavy, and I know some of you are going, oh gosh, I didn't want to hear that. But it's true. Recognize your child is starting from a deficit if they're not coming from the situation that is sort of God designed. And it's not looking down on anybody, because I know a lot of wonderful people who are the product of divorce. I know lots and lots of great people. But understand, the better job you can do building that home life with a spouse. And by the way, it's not just divorce. I mean, Malachi says this. The man who hates and divorces his wife, says the Lord God of Israel, does violence on the one he should protect. So be on your guard and do not be unfaithful. So divorce is huge. But you know what? Just staying married is a really good thing. Staying well married is a really, really great thing. Does that make sense? Okay? There's not just two options. There's not just stay together, don't stay together. There's stay together well, stay together poorly, and then to get divorced. Those are three different options. Because stay together poorly, that's traumatic too. Some of you grew up in that one. Some of you grew up in the traumatic parents who fight all the time, parents who don't like each other, all that stuff. I have been so blessed, my parents still hold hands and they're in their 80s. They like each other. It's crazy. My in-laws still like each other. They're in their 80s. I know a lot of you didn't come up, my mom did not come up in that situation. My mom grew up in a situation where her dad was killed when she was 6 by a jealous husband, not making that up. And then she remarried a guy, and late in life, she said to my mom, his name was Bruce, she says, I love him and I hate him. And that's what my wife grew up in. My mom grew up in, And she chose a different way. I'll say this, and they listen to the sermon, so sorry. I am somewhat convinced my dad came out of the exact opposite. He's the last of 12 of a mom and dad who I've never heard anybody say bad about my grandfather. He was just wonderful, loving man, built an extremely warm family. He and his wife built this incredibly big family of, they were as dysfunctional as families have to be, but they just loved each other. And there was a love that paired up. And I think, I can't, Mom will never admit this. I think Mom married Dad almost as much for his family as for him. I mean, she loves him like crazy. But I think when she walked into that household, she said, I want this. That's what you want to build. You want people to walk into your house who are dating your kid and say, I like the daughter, but I like the parents, and I like the family. I know that's not possible all the time, and I know that some of you guys have already been through that and you can't do it, but that can be a goal. If you're a young family, if you're a young couple, and you're going through a rough patch right now in your marriage, 2 words for you. Fix it. I mean, this is into marriage, but you know, your spouse is screwed up, right? Yeah, so are you. You're both screwed. It's two screwed up people trying to make the best of it. But it can be done. We talked about it last week. It can be done. And if you're in a rough patch and you have kids, do your absolute best to fix it. Not saying you'll never fight again. Every couple fights. Not saying it'll ever be perfect, because remember, your marriage cannot be perfect because you're in it. Okay? But it can be good enough that just you being together gives your kids chips. Do you know that? To this day, seeing my parents together gives chips to me emotionally. It gives chips to my daughters when they see both sets of grandparents living the way they're living. And my daughters have chips that have been poured into them. Now, I've done some things, obviously every parent does, to take a few away. But the overall has been pouring chips in. And that's what you're trying to do with your kids. That's what you're trying to do with your grandkids. That's what you're trying to do with your nieces and nephews. If you have nieces and nephews and they don't have a positive example in their household, give them a positive example out of yours. Okay? Because contrary to what, I can never get his name, Nemo's dad wanted, Marlin, never remember his name. Contrary to what Marlin wanted, bad things are going to happen to Nemo. If he hadn't gotten taken by the person and put in an aquarium in Sydney, something else bad would have happened. That's how life works. Our job is to prepare our kids for those things. Run through them again. Teach your kids they're valuable. Teach your neighbor's kids that they're valuable. Teach the bratty kid down the street that everybody hates that he's valuable. Go to work in our children's ministry and teach a bunch of kids that they're valuable. That was not just a hint, that was an order. Go around letting kids know they're valuable. And you know who else you can do that to? Go around letting adults know that they're valuable. Go around letting waitresses know that they're valuable. Go around letting, are you ready for this? This is really hard. This maybe, I don't think Jesus could pull this off, but let telemarketers know that they're valuable. Let DMV agents know that they're valuable. Go around just dispensing chips all day long, letting people know they're valuable. Because if you're doing it to everybody, you're doing it to your kid. So teach your kids they're valuable. Train them to live in their calling. Give them grace and guidance. And provide stability by staying together as best you can. Okay? This is not complicated. It's hard, but it's not complicated. And it's God's challenge, and it's my challenge to you. Wherever there are kids in your life, do this. All right? And by the way, we talk a lot about ministry. I was half joking about the kids. You do know we have a lot of kids show up on Sunday morning. And some of them come from really good households, and that's wonderful. And some of them come from households that are struggling. Have you ever had an adult speak into your life when you were struggling, and somebody who wasn't your parent came in and said the right thing or just loved you the right way? You ever had that happen to you? You might want to pay that forward. You might want to work in children's ministry. You say, I'm not real good at children's ministry. Okay, do something else then. No. Find a place where you can do this. You know who's really, some of the people really good at this are first impressions people a lot of times. Have you noticed any of the first impressions people who just have an ability when you come in, they get to know who you are now, and they're happy to see you? That make you feel good? Some of you can do that. Find a way to pay it forward. Find a way to do something to serve in a ministry where you can help, okay? All right. What I think I want to do now is I think there's a few parents here. a few people who can influence kids. And what I want to do is I want to close and I want to pray for you. Let's pray. Father, thank you. Thank you that you, for reasons I don't fully understand, took something insanely valuable, somebody who was made in the image of you, and let me help raise 3 of them. There's 5 of them who call me grandpa, or pawpaw, actually. And I get to help again. Father, help us to take this privilege seriously. Kids aren't an accessory. They're an opportunity. Father, for those who are challenged to give their kid value because they haven't received much value themselves because they've been told they don't have value, I pray you would override that lie with truth. Father, to say to yourself that you're not valuable is to lie to yourself. And I pray you would help them speak truth to themselves about their own value, and then take that truth and spread it to their children and to all the children around them. Father, I pray that you give us wisdom as we guide children. Help us to have grace and the regulations they need, the discipline they need. And Father, be with the families here. Father, I know that in the sound of my voice, whether they're in the room or online, there are couples that are struggling. And maybe there's a couple or two, they're looking for a reason to stay together. Father, we're not talking about situations with abuse or anything like that. We're just talking about where they have trouble deciding whether to stay together. I pray you'd help them to stay together for the kids and to work it out for the kids, not just to survive, but to thrive as a couple. And if they have to do it for the kids to start with, let them do it for the kids to start with. But Lord, bring thriving to our families. Bring resiliency to our children. And help us to glorify you in everything we do. In Jesus' name, amen.